Welcome back to day 11 of this 14-day San Francisco sourdough bread making tutorial. In the first week, we made our new sourdough starter. In this week, we've been gearing up to try two recipes. One, a very simple hands-off recipe suitable for complete beginners, and then a much more hands-on advanced recipe for those who already know how to make bread, or for beginners looking for a bit more of a challenge. So today we're finally going to start making our first loaves. This recipe's not completely set it and forget it though, because I still wanted to make sure we're building some good strength into the dough since it's a very wet dough. I'll give you plenty of space to pause the video at each step as we go, but there'll also be a link to download the recipe in the description below. I've put an example of timing on each step to show you how you could make it over the course of 2 days, but obviously you can adjust this to start and bake whenever you'd like. First, we have to build our levain. Ideally, this should be done when your starter is peaked, but if your timing's a little off in either direction, you'll still be fine to use it. Follow the instructions from the day 8 video on the details of building the levain, but for this one we're going to use our standard 30 grams of starter, and then 105 grams of water and 105 grams of bread flour. When that's just about ready to use, we'll weigh out our ingredients for the next step. 924 grams of strong white bread flour, 693 grams of water, 18 grams of salt, and optionally 20 grams of avocado oil or another neutral cooking oil. Then you just wait for your levain to be ready to use. The common test you'll hear about is the float test, where you take a small bit of starter and see if it floats in a bowl of water. If it does, then it's ready to bake with. Some people swear by this method, others say it doesn't work for their starter, but I would suggest that you use this until you start to get to know the look and the smell of your starter. 100% hydration all-white starter, like the one we've made in this series, should look something like this when it's peaked. It looks like loose jelly, and it still smells sweet, but it's starting to develop a bit of a tang. Once it hits that point, we're good to go. So weigh out 139 grams of your levain and combine it with the water in a large bowl. Then whisk together the salt and the flour in a different bowl. Now pour the wet ingredients into the dry ingredients and stir to incorporate. First with a spatula, and then with a bowl scraper or your hands once it starts to come together. And that's really the bulk of the recipe. After this, it's just strategically timed gluten development and a long nap in the fridge before we'll be ready to bake. At this point, we just want to cover our bowl and put it in the same warm spot we've used during our starter development, ideally between 27 to 30 Celsius or 80 to 85 Fahrenheit. If it's lower than that, this bulk fermentation phase will have to be extended a bit. So at this point, you could really just leave it for 2 hours, but we want this loaf to have a bit more strength, so we're going to be performing stretch and folds every 30 minutes. A stretch and fold is a standard technique where you pull up on the edge of the dough until just before it breaks, and then fold it over. Then continue doing this around the bowl until you really can't stretch it out too much without breaking. Then you cover back up and leave it to rest again. You'll do this after 30, 60, and 90 minutes. So after 3 stretch and folds and 2 hours of bulk fermentation, it's time to move on to the pre-shaping phase. Go ahead and tip the dough out onto your counter and sprinkle it with just a bit of flour on the top if it's really sticky, before using your bench scraper to divide it into 2. So we'll look at more advanced shaping methods in the next recipe, but for now we're just going to use the method you see here to develop some tension in the dough. If you don't have a bench scraper, you can use any similar tool like a spatula or even a cutting board. Just continue around the loaf until you have a round bowl shape that has a good amount of surface tension. Then we just leave it there to rest. The gluten will relax and the dough will spread out. Don't worry, this is normal. That's why we shape it a second time to build more strength. Try not to overwork the dough here though, or else all the bubbles will start to join up and be squeezed to the surface. Now another short rest, and then one final shaping, but very gently. A few minutes later and we're ready to put it into its bed for the night. Ideally this will be a specialized banneton, but a simple bowl will do if you don't have one. So best case scenario, you can flour the loaf in banneton before putting it to bed. But if you don't have a banneton, a bowl will do. Hopefully you still have rice flour to keep it from sticking though, because if you use regular flour it tends to stick when you're using a dough with this much hydration. But if you don't have a banneton or rice flour, I've got a bit of a hack for you. Just take some baking or parchment paper and crumple it up. That allows it to better form to your bowl. But even then, you can find that the wet dough will stick to this. But if you then lightly oil the surface, it'll keep it from sticking really well. This hack does have the side effect of producing a bit of a different crust from the oil that'll be left on the surface of the dough, but it's a lot better than having half of it stuck to your tea towel. And now it's time to pop it in the fridge and let the magic happen. This recipe calls for leaving it in there for about a day, but it's really up to you. You can bake it after just a few hours for a very mellow taste, or leave it in there for up to 2 days to get some really pronounced tang. So we've let it develop overnight, and now the time's come to finally bake it. First things first though, we'll need to preheat the oven as high as it'll go for a full hour before you pull it out of the fridge. If you're new to bread making, then your next steps will probably look something like this, where you carefully take it out of the bowl, and then use a sharp knife to score the top in a simple plus pattern. If you have a few of the bonus items though, it might look something more like this, where the loaf comes out of the banneton nicely from the rice flour, and then you add some rice flour for contrast before using your lame to score a fun pattern into the loaf. Either way, the next step is the same. Time to pop it in the oven. If you're using the Dutch oven method, then you should very carefully put your scored loaf into the preheated Dutch oven, pop the top on, and then whack it in the oven. If you're using the open cooking method, then you want a pan to be preheating in the bottom of the oven and a kettle of water to be boiling at the ready. You'll have either a baking steel, pizza stone, or just a baking tray preheated as well and ready to go. Then just carefully put your scored loaf into the oven and add about 2 cups of boiling water to the pan before quickly closing the door. Turn the oven down right away to 240 Celsius or 465 Fahrenheit, and then let it bake with steam for 25 minutes. After that, you'll either be taking the top off your Dutch oven or taking your water tray out, and then turn your oven down to 220 Celsius, 430 Fahrenheit, and bake for another 10 minutes. At this point, if you're using the Dutch oven method, you might want to take out the pot completely to avoid a burnt bottom. Either way, reduce the heat again to about 215 Celsius or 420 Fahrenheit and continue to bake for anywhere up to 20 minutes. Just take it out when the crust gets to the color you like. Okay, so now comes the hardest part. You need to not eat it. Seriously though, it's not done cooking inside and the crumb texture will be very gummy. Try to wait at least 30 minutes. Use this time to take your butter out of the fridge to soften it up, or cutting your favorite cheese to pair with it, or simply by marveling at this beautiful San Francisco sourdough loaf that you just created from scratch. Honestly, it'll feel so great the first time you bake your first loaf. And to be honest, it pretty much feels that same way every time after as well. Now just remember that it's the taste you should be judging yourself on. Do you like it? If so, then it's been a raging success. Looks are overrated and, to be honest, are more about having the right tools than the right technique. Here's an example of 2 loaves that I made with the exact same recipe at the exact same time. On the first one, I used all my standard bread tools, and even with a no-knead recipe, it still turned out pretty good. Now here's what happened when I didn't use any special tools at all. Not quite as much of a looker, eh? But that's the point. They both tasted the same. So if you get bitten by the sourdough bread baking bug, then you can start building up your own set of fun tools, and the excitement will continue to build as you see the improvement in each and every loaf. So how was it? Success or failure? I'd love to know. Comment below, tag me on Instagram or Twitter, and use the tag I'm a loaf hacker to show off your loaves. And when you're ready, you can move on to the more advanced recipe that's coming up on the next video. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss it when the next video is pushed live. I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next video where we'll get started working our way through the advanced San Francisco sourdough recipe. Bye for now.